Institute Cooperative Broadcasting Council presents Agnes de Mille, the choreographer as creator. Essay number 3 in the National Association of Educational Broadcasters series, The Creative Mind, produced by WGBH-FM in Boston under a grant from the Educational Television and Radio Center. These conversations explore the creative process as it pertains to the American artist and scientist in the 20th century. And here is our host and commentator for The Creative Mind, Lyman Bryson.
In these essays about the creative mind in the arts and the sciences, where does the dancer come in? What does a dancer create? A pattern, that's clear enough. A pattern which is ephemeral in its nature. It goes on the wind like a song sung or a poem recited. But nevertheless, while it's there and we're watching it, it works in our nerves and muscles in a sympathetic way so that its rhythms are reproduced almost in our imaginations. In fact, they're reproduced potentially in our actual bodies. We get something of the same sensation, something of the same mastery, which the dancer, by her tremendous discipline and her native powers, is able to have over her own plastic behavior. We get some of that in ourselves. We don't deserve it. It's vicariously produced for us by the artist, but it is our enjoyment, of course. Mozart is reported to have said about a young lady in whom he had a passing interest that she couldn't possibly be a musician because she couldn't count. Now, this seems at first thought rather trivial. I think not. I think this is the basic getting at the root of the thing of the great genius. If the lady couldn't count, she certainly couldn't be a musician. She probably couldn't even dance unless she was in the arms of someone who had so strong a rhythm that she had to submit. Rhythm, then, timing, emotion, which by great discipline is conveyed to our imaginations and in which we participate. This is what the dancer creates. One thing Miss de Mille says strikes me of very special importance. We all know something about the cruel discipline which a dancer has to go through. We know something about the arduous manipulations of the muscles and the nerves and the very structure of the body, which makes a dancer able to express in her body, in her plastic action, the thought that she has, make these wonderful patterns. We can imagine ourselves trying to perceive that, trying to do that, but not with, I think, any great supposition that we could do it easily. It's much too hard. We're inclined to think that because of this, the artist, dancer, having acquired this skill, can then just let herself go, act out in motion his caprices, just as a child might do with a child's gestures. Mr. Mill makes it quite clear that the dancer, like a pianist or a singer, is trying to give expression to the thought of an inventor of the dance, a choreographer, trying to carry out designs which someone else has invented, with their own interpretation, of course, but nevertheless expressing a design which somebody else created. The real creative artist, perhaps that's not true either, because if you say the real creative artist is the composer, not the interpretive musician, then you could say that the real creative artist is the choreographer and not the dancer, but I wouldn't say either one of those things. There are two kinds of creativeness when you have an interpretive artist, the composer and the pianist, the choreographer and the dancer. And each one of these interpretive artists uses all his skill, all his intelligence, all his intuition, all his intuitive sensitivity to bring into a structure of beauty for our delight and our enjoyment what the composer originally thought. The real difficulty, as Miss de Mille makes quite clear, is that there is not yet any form of notation, any way of writing down what the choreographer thinks, any way of expressing on a sheet of paper the design of the choreographer so firmly that the interpretive artist is thoroughly guided. But dancers work with musicians. They have to. They dance to music. So there's a relationship between these two arts, which is inescapable if we're thinking about the dance. And Nadja Eisenberg and Miss de Mille began their conversation at this point. When we respond to a dancer, we're responding also to a composer. And Miss de Mille was asked about this relationship.
Well, of course, from ancient time, from the beginning of any kind of creative movement or effort, I think sound and movement have been inextricably intertwined. And dancing is in many ways dependent on music, because dancing that exists without music seems somehow incomplete, or rather it does to us now because we are so used to hearing rhythm. We are not used to seeing rhythm. They are both time arts. They exist in time, but dancing exists in time-space. And of course, as a spatial art, it is like architecture or painting. It's the only art that is a time-space art. But in the sense that it is a time art, it is like music. And it uses many, many of the devices that music uses. Repetition, development of basic themes, recurrences, reprises of melodic lines, and so forth. It develops that way as opposed to the way architecture or painting develops, or storytelling. Dancing, of course, is also dramatic, but that's another thing. The main point of difference between dancing and music as a functional artistic experience is, I think, that there is no written language. There's no script for dancing that is practical and in use up to now. We are beginning to get one now, but there has not been. And for this reason, there's no literature, which means that the material of dancing, the living human body, moving in time-space, is a fresh experience always for the composer, each time he composes. And he has to work on, well, how shall I put it, with live ammunition, so to speak. He cannot do his preparation beforehand and record it the way a composer can. This modifies every single thing he does right through the whole experience.
Doesn't that make it rather difficult for the choreographer who is just beginning? He has essentially no school to go to.
It makes it difficult for the choreographer who's ending as well. It's hard. It's a tough problem, and it means that every daily rehearsal relies on human memory and human goodwill and human patience, and demands this in the way that no other art does.
Is the recording of a dance before the development of dance notation a physical situation such as a pianist might have, whose fingers, they say, remember the music?
Well, dancers' bodies remember the dance steps, and as they hear the music, they tend to go back through the old patterns automatically. But of course, human memory is fallible, and choreographers are notoriously bad about this. I think because they keep erasing from the tablets of their mind, so to speak, everything they did previously. They have to, or they'd never get any new ideas. You have to wash clean all the time. Dancers probably have the most highly trained memories of any people in the world. I think this is true, much more highly trained than musicians. They remember every role in their entire career.
Do dancers have to be musically trained as well? When you were speaking of the relation between dance and music, I wonder whether in the actual performance, for instance, they have to understand the music.
Many of them are not, and many of them are very faulty musicians. If you mean, do they have to have a response to beat, to rhythmic beat? They ought to have, though some quite famous ones have not had and are offbeat all the time. But most of them do have a sense of instinctive reaction to the downbeat, to the rhythmic impulse. As far as being musically trained, can they read music and understand music? Not all of them, by any means. It is almost essential to a choreographer. A choreographer who can't read a score and compose along with the musical composer is at a grave disadvantage. And of course, I always advise dancers to get as much musical training as they can.
Does the choreographer compose in a simultaneous line with the music or in contrast to it?
Do you mean with the composer or with the music?
No, I meant actually with the music, with the beat of the music. Does the strong point of the dance step come down on the strong beat of the music, for instance?
Well, this is a matter of taste and artistry. And the greatest musician acknowledged in the field of choreographers is probably George Balanchine. And his extraordinary use of music, really magical, I think rests partly on the fact that he never does the expected thing. Sometimes when there's a climax in the music, he will mirror it in the gesture, and sometimes he will bypass it and reflect it back in another way. This is entirely art. Anthony Tudor, who was a master choreographer, invented a whole way of doing light designs against the musical design, if you understand what I mean. It's a kind of a counterpoint visually. But this has to be done with great subtlety and delicacy.
I imagine that otherwise the two lines could simply separate.
Well, they could separate and never come together again. And there are certain elemental things, like it's nice to end together.
I would imagine. So do you actually have the choreographer, the composer rather, sit in the room with you while you choreograph a dance?
Well, it depends for what purpose the dance is and who the composer is. When I worked with Aaron Copland, for instance, on Rodeo, which was my first big success in the ballet world, I made up a scenario and broke it down into actual minutes. He had typewritten pages in his hand. He said, I want to know how many minutes you want for each episode and the exact qualities you want. And I did that for him, and I also had devised some of the movement patterns earlier. I'd done this before I went to him, so that I could say, it's this kind of movement, and this is the kind of sound I would like to have with it. Vaguely, you see. He then went away and composed great hunks of it and brought it to me and said, is this fine? And I said, yes. And then he played me, I think 6 weeks later, the entire score, start to finish, and I said, it's divine, fell weeping into his arms with joy. And he said, that's it, honey. Not one bar more. And I went away with the ballet russe. And then I changed the scenario because it didn't seem, as I worked on it, quite strong enough, and I improved it. And at the end, the girl got the boy that we didn't think she would, instead of the boy I had originally planned her to get. And I said to Aaron, she seems flighty if she changes her mind in 8 bars of music. And he said, I'm sorry. That's it.
8 bars.
8 bars it was. Now, on the other hand, when I worked with Morton Gould on Fall River Legend, he kept adjusting and changing. Some composers won't cut a bar, no matter what the choreographer wants, because they feel their music is sacrosanct. These, I feel, are not really theatre men, and I think dancing does belong in the theatre. There are different forms of theatre, but I think it does belong there, and I know that the great works, nearly all of them, have been collaborative works. Stravinsky, collaborated with Fokine, but I don't think either one or the other should be rigid about this. When we work for the musical comedy theatre, there you have to work from the song material. And what you're given when you start a show is the play and some songs. And then it's decided between you and the writer and composer which songs shall have dances attached to them. The choreographer, as a rule, makes that choice, but it is done in consultation. And then he goes away with the arranger, the dance arranger, that is the dance music arranger. And
not the original composer?
Very rarely. Kurt Weill did, but he's the only one that ever did that I've worked with. And sit in the room with the composer, and I say, now, this is the kind of movement I would like to work through. And it's generally a woman named Trudy Rittman, who is an absolutely brilliant person and has done pretty nearly every smash hit that you can name in Broadway. I don't think there's been anything from South Pacific through My Fair Lady, through Brigadoon, and, well, name them. And she's done them. And she will kind of improvise along with me. And when we get something that we both feel is good rhythmically, that's the beginning. And I work on the dances, and then she works, literally shoving the musical beat under our feet as we go.
Do you compose in your head or on a dance floor where you actually physically test out the movements that you're thinking about?
Both. I will have to now speak of my own methods, because other people have other methods. I generally approach any ballet or any dance with a central idea of what I want to say and how I feel, mainly how I feel. And then you get if it's a formal dance, you get your atmosphere and general pattern. You get those ideas first. If it's a story dance, you get the sequence of events and the characterizations. Then I have to find what I call the idiom of expression. And this is not thought through. This is discovered, and it's discovered through movement. And it may take me a very long time. I get, personally, dramatic episodes and gestures, acting gestures that reveal character are quite easy and instinctive for me. But the dance gestures, the stylized gestures that reveal emotion are hard come by, and I really have to work a long time. You get yourself sort of worked into a sweat, literally, and spiritually both. And when you have stopped thinking, and I don't mean that in any trivial sense, when you have reached a depth of consciousness which is beneath the editing parts of the brain, you will come up with something that you didn't know you had, or that you didn't know you remembered, and it will speak to everybody. The dances that fail are the dances that are thought out through the top of the head. Then when I have those gestures, then I can sit down and make a dance up on a piece of paper. Now, it may not always work, because when Mr. Copland composes for the piano, he has a scale, and it never changes. And the piano keys sound like the piano keys. They don't suddenly sound like a bass drum. But if I take a dancer, say I'm working for a man, and say, these are the gestures, and I show him, of course the thing has to be totally transformed into his body. He's a man and not a woman, and he's 6 feet something and weighs so much more. He also has his entire way of moving, and each human being is unique.
Do you compose for a solo and a group at the same time? Do you move many figures around the stage in your head when you're doing the initial work?
Oh, yes, oh, yes. As I say, if I have the clue, the nucleus of the pattern in gesture, and proven on another body so that I can see it. I take a dancer that knows me well and that I can work with comfortably, and we try things out. And then I say, that's wonderful. It will probably modify in the course of a couple of hours of work. But it will modify and clarify. And then, with that in mind, I can compose around it. Sometimes I do the whole pattern first of the group and add on the soloist, and sometimes I begin with the soloist and add on the group. It depends. And different methods in the same dance.
Is the difference between lyrical, expressionistic composition and dramatic a question of temperament for you? You mentioned before that...
Oh, no, I think that's just the difference. I mean, does Copland compose lyrically or dramatically? Or that's not a very good simile. It's like writing a lyric tone poem and an opera. It's not temperament. It's you're working through different styles. Isn't that what you mean?
Yes, it is. I wondered whether, I think that your dancers are very well known for their characterization, for instance.
Well, that's, I think, my chief gift. I use, as Lawrence Lang of the Guild said, you use personalities like color on a palette. And when I go into a show, I hire the dancers and promise them nothing. That is understood. If they are known dancers with reputations, I also promise them that they can leave if they don't like what I give them after 2 weeks. But there they are, and that's the way I've made discoveries, just on the rehearsal floor. If I see a girl with a lovely quality, I actually build that into the dance.
So that actually there is a two-way response between you and the piece in creation.
Oh, yes, and the dancers are very largely responsible for the creative effort, because a lot comes out of them back, you see, changing and modifying and suggesting, above all suggesting.
You mentioned before, Mr. Mill, that the rhythm was an important factor in your collaboration with the composer. Would you say that this is the governing communication between you and the music?
No, I don't think so. I've been told by my pianist arranger, Trude Rittman, that I get most of my ideas out of melody. I wasn't aware of this until she did say so, but she's worked with me for so many years, I think she must know. I am terribly moved by melody, and changes of key have an overpowering effect on me. Jerome Robbins works with rhythm, apparently. Once he gets a hold of a rhythm, it absolutely possesses him, and he can spin out of his own body a great deal of most beautiful movement pattern. And then the composer catches up at the other end. Both forces, of course, are extremely important.
Do you find that the storyline that you were speaking about before is ever derived from actual stories that you have read, or legends or events?
Oh,
or is...
yes. Sometimes I make them up, but very often, when the ballet Lizzie Borden was just taken straight from Lizzie Borden, of course we changed it a lot. They have to be changed, they have to be transformed so that they make dance material. You take the inner emotional values out. That's what you try to do.
Is that true also of gesture that's adapted? For instance, in something like Rodeo, the Western feeling that you get is a question of adapting.
Well, yes, this is a very interesting field. how far can you change and distort it? I think you have to first try to understand the kind of people that produced the gesture and the circumstances under which it was produced, and never violate that. You can have people jumping very high where they are not able to because they're not trained to, but if they would like to jump high, then I think that's a legitimate liberty to take. You cannot have a nice girl who's gone to a party with her best boy stand on her head, because she would be sent home and he wouldn't like her anymore. And that's when I think you are really violating the principles. And then there are styles. You can't suddenly have a girl of English extraction go into a series of steps that come from the Congo or from the Pueblo Indian rituals, even if remotely derived. This is a matter of really delicate taste.
Do you think that there is a language that is almost the same as an audible language for various parts of the country in relation to people's movements?
Oh, well, this is very interesting. Gesture goes way back, and the most common gestures, like nodding and shaking the head or shaking hands or thumbing the nose, are beyond history. And with the earliest cave paintings and even marks on the pyramids, we know that those gestures existed, and they are common to every race, everywhere in the whole world, as far as we could tell. So that is an extremely interesting point. There are certain races that have variants of these gestures. The Italians use their hands in special ways. All the Latin people have certain little gestures. There's a way of shaking the hand at the wrist as though something had gotten too hot for handling, which anyone who's traveled in Spain or Italy will recognize immediately. And no Anglo-Saxon uses it. But at the same time, we know what it means when we see it.
Do you think that modern dance owes a great deal to the expressionist dances?
You mean to Duncan?
To Duncan?
Oh, well, it stems its direct line. She was the great revolutionist. It wasn't just taking the ballet shoes off and taking the ballet skirts off. It was just the peripheral indication of what she did. What she said was, remember why men dance. Remember what they danced about. And it was the most profound reasons in life. And they hadn't been dancing for those reasons. They'd been dancing for the most flippant and delicious, mind you, and pretty, but flippant and casual entertainment. And she reminded them that they danced for life and death and the worship of God. And she reminded them very strongly of this. And after that, there was an enormous change, not just in dancing, but in the whole approach to the art and to the art of the theater, because she was so involved in it. And people began remembering that in the old Greek days, the dramas were ritualistic. They were expressions of faith between the artists and the people who went to see them, and that they expected to have their lives ennobled by this experience. Well, that was, I must say, a novelty, and particularly in America, which is very Calvinistic, where dancing had been considered absolutely unforgivable for any person brought up in the fear of God. And just any person who had made it a career was an outcast socially. Those are facts. Now, all of this has changed.
Do you think that the ritual quality that you spoke of before has anything to do with the role of the male in American dance? That is, as the dance lost its dramatic or dynamic relation to the society, the male dancer no longer had a function in it?
The Christian church threw dancing out, and it never developed. The Christian church used music and architecture and painting and developed them to the forms that we now know them. For instance, it was the monasteries that invented musical script, and it took 500 years to do that, and that's a tremendous gift to our civilization. That means that if you are a man of great powers, you will write books or you will write music, but you won't write dancing because it's gone tomorrow.
What advice would you give the young choreographer starting out? We've mentioned that there are no schools actually to go to, and he doesn't have scripts or text to refer to of past dances.
Well, it's a very hard road to hoe, but I would say the first thing he must do is to try, and he must try with people, so that if he's in school or college, he must try there with whatever people he can get his hands on, or to come into a room and be patient. Then he must see whatever good dancing he can. There are many companies now traveling around and on TV and pictures and so forth. If he's discriminating, he can see a lot of very good dancing. The best thing for him to do, though, I believe absolutely in the apprentice system. And I think he should attach himself to any group he can where there's a first-class choreographer working and watch the process of a work in the professional furnaces. Get in there as a dancer somehow and watch and participate. He'll learn more than any other way.
Do you think a choreographer, for instance, needs a liberal arts education or a college education even, or do you think that it would be better for them to start dancing right away?
I think that a college education helps a choreographer, but there are only 2 in the world that I know of that have it. And there just isn't time. That's all there is to it. And dancers can't have it.
The renaissance of dance in America, you think, is partly due to the musical comedy, giving dance as a living wage in another public area of expression?
Resultant. No, I think the basic thing is, as I say, that the social taboo has been lifted, that it's time for people to dance. I think these things happen, that this is an epoch of gesture and movement, and in every field you feel this. It has to do also, I think, with the resurgence of women as creative artists and in all business fields and fields of ambition and endeavor. For the first time, there's really almost no or very little restraint put upon them, and dancing is their most beloved function. I think it's very basically instinctive with them.
What do you think that women can do? You mentioned the fact that
strangely enough, they
was...
do make choreographers, and that is. I don't think they make the best, but they make the most daring, and that is a function. They make wonderful doctors. They make wonderful psychologists. They make great teachers and scientists, research scientists, wherever patience and continuity play a part. Well, they have been always great novelists because they're good storytellers. There never has been a lyric poet on a par with the great men. There never has been a painter. As far as I know, there's never been a great woman architect of any kind on any par. I think that's because no man would lay a brick if she asked him to. They have been great visionaries. And when I say poets, in a sense, Joan of Arc and Santa Teresa and so forth were visionary poets. And I think if women are expected to do what they can do that is meaningful and effective, and not compete with men, and compete with every possible expectation of their falling short of a ridiculous goal, you'll see something happen. It's like having women go in for high jumping. Why? I don't see why men do either, because gazelles go higher than either. Or the 100-yard dash, all you need is a good cheetah, and then that's it. That's been won. But if you ask people to do what they, of their nature, can do best, and then honor them for that, I think you'll get great creativity.
Agnes de Mille, the choreographer as creator. Conversation number 3 in a series exploring the creative process as it pertains to the American artist and scientist in the 20th century. Host for The Creative Mind, Lyman Bryson. Producer for the series, Jack D. Summerfield, with William Cavness and Nadja Eisenberg as production associates. Next week, Harlow Shapley, the theoretical scientist as creator. The Creative Mind is produced and recorded by WGBH-FM in Boston for the National Association of Educational Broadcasters under a grant from the Educational Television and Radio Center.
This program was distributed by the National Educational Radio Network.